Thank you very much for joining us today. Before we actually start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which this lecture takes place, the land of the Wurundjeri, and I pay respects to the elders and family past, present, and emerging. We are very fortunate today to have Neil Leach with us, all the way from Los Angeles. Neil is an architect and professor in the UK, from the UK. He currently directs the Doctor of Design program at Florida International University. He has also taught at the Architectural Association, Harvard, GSD, Columbia, Cornell, IACS, IARC, and I'm sure I might be forgetting some. He is the co-founder of Digital Futures, an online educational platform, a former researcher for NASA, and member of the Academia Europea. He has published over 40 books on architectural theory and digital design. He is currently working on AI, as you all know, by the title of the lecture and his most recent books, and is author of the book Architecture in the Age of Artificial Intelligence, which is already in its second edition, co-editor of Machine Hallucinations, 2022, and author of his most current publication, The AI Design Revolution by Routledge, that I believe is coming up, 25. Yeah. And I leave you with Neil, but please help me welcome him today. Thank you.
Thank you much. Thank you very much, Lyra. I know Lyra from the AA and the GSD. It's great to be there. I'm going to jump straight in because there's not much time. What I'll simply say is that I'm not going to talk about the technical side of things, but we do have a lot of technical tutorials on digital futures. So if you go to digitalfutures.international, you'll find a whole YouTube library, and not only about how to use AI, which of course is changing almost every day, but also things about AI, neuroscience, and architecture, which I think is neuroscience is the really interesting new theoretical debate. And I've also put my Instagram there. That's where I put my experiment, shall we say. Let me just jump straight in, and I'm just going to talk briefly by showing, and this is the stuff that I'm sure all of you were doing on Instagram, on Midjourney and DALL-E and so on, just experimenting, playing around with what you can do. And what I want to point out is this is really not what AI is. This is just a sketching tool. I think it's utterly superficial, frankly. And there's much more to AI than that, and I want to sort of dig more deeply into things like large language models today to explain what really is going on and understand what is powering this. This is just an application of AI. And I also think that in terms of architecture and urbanism, what's in the pipeline, as it were, is about to be launched in terms of software. That's what's going to radically change how we operate, and it will radically change how we operate. I'm fortunate to be in position. I'm supervising for both the Doctor of Design degree and also for a PhD in Tongji, Wan Yu He, who is, I think, the leading person in terms of pushing forward this technology. But things are going to be radically different eventually in the future. So maybe I could just kind of outline my attitude towards AI. I'm constantly amazed by AI. On a daily basis, I'm more and more amazed by AI. But I would also say that I'm also more and more terrified by AI, and I mean that sincerely. When I first started working on this, I guess about 2016, I was coming out of swarm intelligence, and Roland Snooks and I did a book on swarm intelligence and moved into AI 2016, 2017, and I then got a contract first with the RIBA Publishing, then I shifted to Bloomsbury, the Harry Potter publishers, and I was working at the summer of 2019 on this manuscript, and I felt a bit compromised because this was both amazing but also pretty terrifying. I felt a bit like Elon Musk, who was both using AI in Tesla, SpaceX, Neuralink, and whatever, at the same time warning us it could be the end of civilization. So I went back to my Bloomsbury, my publishers, and said, can I divide it into two different books? One with a white cover, like The Angel, about the positive side of AI, and one with a black cover, like The Devil, the dark side, the Black Mirror side of AI. And the latter has not been published, and I had intended to put it off for some time, but the future is upon us before we realize, and maybe I need to start working on it fairly soon. But my point is there's nothing evil about AI. AI is just a tool, and like any tool, it's a question of who uses it and for what. I can use a kitchen knife to cut up my vegetables. I can also use it to murder you with. But so far, no kitchen knife has ever been convicted of a murder. But it is terrifyingly capable and getting more capable every day. There's something about these images, although they are superficial, that just shows you quite what it can do. So today I'm going to give a twist to my normal lecture and focus on, for David and Laura, on cities a little bit more, what I call brain cities in the book. But just to briefly introduce what is AI, because look, we all use the term, but maybe not so many people know what it means. I think in a shorthand version would be to say that AI is a digital brain. Now, it's not the same as a brain at all, but now that we're using neural networks, it's certainly modeled on the brain. I like this comment by Margaret Bowden, in her book published in 2009, Research in AI seeks to make computers do the sorts of things that minds can do. Well, I think it's a bit out of date now for two reasons. I mean, it's a nice comment, but it's two reasons. One, there are certain things that AI can do that just we can't do. We don't stand any chance of beating AI at chess or Go anymore. And ChatGPT, we are told, knows 10,000 times more than any one individual. The other question is, or maybe I'll just kind of comment on ChatGPT. When it first came out, the day after, I don't know if you were watching it, but there was the World Cup quarterfinal between Brazil and Croatia. And my friend Angelica Poncio from Brazil, who's part of our Digital Futures organization, was watching the match, as I was. And Brazil were leading 3-0, and then it was 3-3 all of a sudden. Then they went to penalties, and this guy, Neymar, the leading best player, is sitting looking very disconsolate because he never got to take his penalty. He was number 5 in the list. And Angelica went to ChatGPT and said, who should have taken the first penalty? And it said the best player. They should have been Neymar on first. And maybe history would have been different. But at that point I thought, holy shit, this thing is going to be very useful in the future. And the other thing I think is that the question of does AI need to be the same as the mind? I mean, the crucial difference between the neural network of the brain and the artificial neural network of AI is that even though they're called the same, these are neurons and these are synapses connecting them. These are the layers, and there are anything up to 5,000 layers in a deep learning neural network. And then the flow of information goes from left to right, governed by the weights on the synapses. And even though they're called the same, they're not really the same. And some commentators don't even use the word don't even use the word neuron. But the main difference is AI is not conscious, it's not sentient, it's not self-aware, at least for now. But the question I would say is, so what? Does it need to be? Does it need to be conscious? As long as the machine does what it's meant to do, as long as my toaster makes toast properly, I don't care if it's sentient or not. And I think as far as AI is concerned in terms of design, as long as it produces interesting designs, who cares if it's sentient or not? Anyway, so what is AI? Well, it's not this. Despite all the marketing by Hanson Robotics, Sophia, the humanoid robot, is not an example of AI. In fact, in the discipline of AI, some of the leading figures go apoplectic about Sophia. They think it is a complete fraud, and so on and so on. Sophia is no more AI than a Tesla car is AI. It might be controlled by AI, but it's not AI in itself. If you want to think what AI is, don't think humanoid robot, think algorithms, think software, think programming. Because essentially AI is just software. It's very sophisticated software, but it is software nonetheless. And as such, it's kind of invisible. So in the office of the future, we will be surrounded by AI, but we won't probably be surrounded by humanoid robots. In fact, we already are totally surrounded by AI. And a year or so ago, I would say this, and people would be surprised, perhaps not so much so. But if you think about our phones, AI is what filters out our spam, it's what finishes off our sentences on Gmail, it's what recognizes our friends on Facebook, it's what translates on WeChat, it's what allows us to order Ubers, and so on and so on and so on. Our phones are completely populated with AI-driven apps. And in my first book, I made this comment. It is as though the Earth has been invaded by an invisible, super-intelligent alien species. I'm really glad I used the term alien for reasons I'll explain in a moment. So a brief history of AI. And the history of AI is really kind of weird because it's full of complete accidents along the way. Suddenly we discover that certain things work and certain things don't work and so on. But it is kind of interesting. It actually goes back, probably the first person to conceptualize the connection between computing and and intelligence was Alan Turing in a paper that he published in 1950. In those days, the term artificial intelligence had yet to be coined. And of course, tragically, he didn't live to see that. He died in 1954, we think from suicide, because he was shamed, he was convicted of lewd acts for being homosexual. Anyway, whatever it is, we lost somebody who could have made a huge contribution to AI. The term itself was coined in 1955 in advance of an event that took place in 1956 at Dartmouth College in the States, where all the smartest and the brightest got together. This, for example, is Marvin Minsky, this is Claude Shannon, and this might be John McCarthy, I'm not sure exactly, but anyway, it was coined in 56 for this event, and John McCarthy, actually this is him down here in the survivors photo of 2006 when they met again on the 50th anniversary. John McCarthy was a person who coined the term, and he was never very happy with it, but as he put it, I had to call it something. And they wanted to distinguish it from cybernetic theory at the time anyway. But so they developed this term, artificial intelligence. And it's not a very good term. I mean, there's nothing artificial about AI. It's synthetic maybe, but it's not artificial. And as soon as you adopt the term intelligence, you automatically start anthropomorphizing it. You start thinking in terms of human intelligence. Anyway, their plan had been to solve the basic problems of AI within 2 years. That didn't happen. In fact, the first 50 years of AI was a whole series of overhyped assumptions and then, disasters, letdowns. AI failed to do what it was expected to do, and they went through a series of what they call AI winters, when funding was withdrawn, when it was clear that it wasn't doing what they wanted. And at the time, it was obviously during the Cold War, and the primary purpose they wanted it for was to translate Russian, to understand what the Soviets were saying, but it wasn't very good in those days. So famously, there's an example of the American expression, out of sight is out of mind, which when you translate it into Russian and back again, as they did using AI, you get the expression, an invisible lunatic, clearly a long way from the original one. Anyway, and there have been these 5 different camps that have been pursuing approaches towards AI. The 2 leading ones being connectionism based on neural networks and symbolic AI based on logic. And unfortunately, in some ways, the connectionism fell out of favor. It didn't help. The leading exponent died in a boating accident. And then also Marvin Minsky published an article where he basically trashed it, a book about perceptrons, saying this is going nowhere, forget it, it's useless, and so on. And possibly as a result of that, they really didn't get much done in the first 50 years. And when they met together, and this is Minsky in the middle here, at the bottom here again, when they got back together in 2006, they basically concluded that they had nothing much to show. AI had been a complete failure. And they also said that it was probably, they felt it wasn't going to achieve much in the future either. Well, by a curious coincidence, actually 2006 was roughly the time when there was a kind of a revolution in AI that we now know as the deep learning revolution. And it happened largely because of GPUs, graphic processing units, which weren't invented for the purpose. They were invented for gaming, but they discovered they could really enhance computers, speed them up, and make them much more powerful. And they came out around the year 2000. But the person to thank in some ways for all this is a guy called Geoffrey Hinton, who actually studied architecture for 2 days at the University of Cambridge. He decided it wasn't for him. And when I mentioned this to Marta Sigari from Foster & Partners, she said, he's smart. It took him 2 days. It took me 5 years to discover architecture was not for me. Anyway, he moved in to do natural sciences and eventually went into the world of psychology and neuroscience. He comes from a very distinguished family. His great-great-grandfather was George Boole of Boolean geometry fame. And one of his relatives was, in fact, his middle name is Everest because one of his relatives was that British guy who surveyed India and gave Everest its name. I say renamed Everest. I'm sure Everest had its own name before that. But so it's Geoffrey Everest Hinton. But anyway, he was stubborn, and he stubbornly pursued this idea that he thought the way you'd get to understand AI would be through neuroscience. In fact, he actually accidentally got into the world of AI by neuroscience because of the neural networks he was developing. And then at a certain time, when these GPUs came across, all of a sudden, things would work. And he'd literally been in a situation, they were out of favor. And he had to, when he published a paper, he had to scrub any references to neural networks to get these papers accepted. And they're the basic reasons. There are many reasons why basically it took off. By far the most important one was the development of GPUs around 2000 that really enhanced computers and made them much faster and so on. So we now end up in a situation where we have what is now called deep learning, connectionism, neural networks. That's pretty much what we're talking about now when we talk about AI. ChatGPT, Midjourney, DALL-E, and all that's all based on deep learning. And deep learning is a subset of machine learning that itself is a subset of artificial intelligence. Think of them like these Russian toys nested inside each other. So we still use the term artificial intelligence that was invented in or coined in 55, but the difference between what they were talking about and what we're talking about now is even greater, in fact, much, much greater than the difference between the first very primitive car invented and a Tesla self-driving car. It is absolutely enormous. There is no comparison between the two. But we're now in the deep learning revolution, and there won't be any more winters as far as I'm concerned. It's really taken off. But Hinton's work really sort of became, let's say, visible in 2012 when with some PhD students of his, he entered a competition that had been organized by Fei Li looking at how you could recognize images. Now, we all have facial recognition on our phones now. We take it for granted, but in 2012, we didn't. And he came in and used his neural network, which was regarded as a kind of obsolete technology, a bit like a steam engine or something like that. And he came in and he trounced the opposition, and he just wiped the board. And this was a big shock for everyone. And as a result, everyone else said, of course, I always thought that neural networks are the way forward. Yes, I always believed that. And suddenly everyone was converted to this new way of thinking. Fei Li describes it, maybe in a slightly exaggerated mode. She says it was like the world speed record was beaten by 100 miles an hour by someone driving a Honda Civic. Maybe that's an exaggeration. But anyway, it really caused a shock, and all of a sudden, the neural networks were here. They worked. But the real holy grail for computer science was not to recognize an image. It was to go the opposite, to start with the word bird and come up with the image of a bird. And they discovered eventually, there was a guy, Alex Morvinsurf, who was working as an engineer for Google, who discovered that actually you could effectively invert the network. In other words, instead of going from left to right, you could actually go from right to left, and you would end up producing an image, a pretty crazy image. This is what's called deep dream, or now known as deep dream. And what happens if you train a neural network on, this looks like dogs and serpents or something, and maybe an oil lamp or God knows what, you will get this very trippy image coming out. It's trippy because it's pose invariant, as they say. It's not, the information about where things should be has been lost, and it's simply coming out all over the place. But it caused a minor sensation when it came out. And the first ever exhibition of AI-generated art was based on Deep Dream, 2016, I think it was. Blaise Guiriakos curated it in San Francisco. Blaise Guiriakos is another central figure. He's the guy who set up Google's Artist Machine Intelligence Group and has really sponsored a lot of this kind of work. Anyway, the real breakthrough came when this guy, also in Canada, because Geoffrey Hinton was based in Toronto, Ian Goodfellow was also doing a PhD elsewhere in Canada, and he went out in the pub one night with his mates and was talking about something, and eventually realized this could be a breakthrough, and then after the pub went back and wrote it up. And this basically is what we know as generative adversarial networks, a really effective technique, which depends on having two separate neural networks. One, a generator, which takes random noise and produces images based on that, which then the second neural network, called a discriminator, judges against a training set and decides whether it's convinced or not. Think of it a bit like producing a fake Van Gogh and then an art critic saying, not convinced by that, not convinced by that. But eventually might be. And in the process, the discriminator effectively trains the generator to improve its act until eventually you come up with something that is really a much better version of what we saw before. This is a Style Gans, one of the early versions that's based on Hollywood actors, I guess. It's a very laborious process. You have to train the neural networks on thousands of images, and over time it gets better, but it's hard work, and the resolution is not that great. But nonetheless, you can see this is something that is really quite surprising. These are all what we call deep fakes. These are people who don't exist. Every time you refresh your browser, you get another another face. If you go to the site, this person does not exist, you'll be able to try it out for yourself. And the cat lovers can also go to a site called This Cat Does Not Exist. And this really was something special. Meanwhile, in architecture, we were totally asleep, absolutely totally asleep. In 2009, Refik Anadol had started projecting onto Gary's Walt Disney Concert Hall in LA. We were kind of aware of those things, but I don't know. In 2019, I submitted a proposal to curate the British Pavilion at the Venice Biennale with Refik Anadol, with Zaha Hadid Architects, and sponsored by Google, with Jane Barry and a few others involved. This was really a dream team as far as I'm concerned. And we had imagined the possibility of hallucinating buildings a bit like those faces, but we got nowhere. We weren't even shortlisted. It was as though it wasn't on people's consciousness at the time. Nonetheless, Refik went ahead and started doing what we proposed to do, to hallucinate not faces but buildings. And he trained a neural network, used his version of style GANs, and trained it on all the images you could find of the work of Zaha Hadid Architects. And even though sadly Zaha is no longer around, you nonetheless can train this thing, and eventually it will produce something that is kind of vaguely like something that Zaha might have designed. And then eventually out of the computer comes this image, which was effectively the first ever image, I think anyway, using a GAN to generate an architectural design, and that was the image we put on the cover of my book. Not the first book on AI and architecture, but the first book in English. The first book was in Chinese by Wan Yu He, whom I'll talk about in a moment. And this is the white cover book, the angel, the positive side of AI. It came out in December the 16th, 2021, middle of COVID, and we didn't have a book launch because no one was in their office. And it was out of date very soon afterwards. Anyway, this is then people developed it further. This is a use of cycle GANs, where you work with two unpaired data sets, and effectively, rather than just interpolating, with style GANs, you've got a finite set, and you're just simply averaging or blending or something. It's something novel, but it's only within that set. With this, you can effectively breed different options. This is the work that's done by Daniel Bolojan, who I would say is probably the leading expert in terms of AI and architecture. He's now teaching at Florida Atlantic University and still working with Corp Himmelblau. And this is one of their projects called Deep Himmelblau, where they take the work of the office and breed it with geological formations and get these kind of vaguely building-like things, which at the time, in about 2021, was certainly the state of the art, and this wasn't too bad, and you can kind of see, there are glitches. It's everything with a GAN is, if it hasn't got a glitch, it had been photoshopped afterwards. So, but anyway, it wasn't too bad, but it was hard work, and you had to have a computer specialist, and so on and so on and so on. And then something happened, which is completely different. So that was the image. So that was a project we put on Machine Hallucinations, which came out in April 2022 and had about 1 month before it was out of date in terms of images. Then something happened, which we now know is we call diffusion models. At least I call it diffusion models, which is a very different technique. It uses Gaussian noise and two diffusion processes to disrupt and then repair an image. And it's based on massive pre-trained neural networks. So you haven't got to do your own preparation. It's done, but these are all generic ones. So they're not specialized on architecture or anything, but they're generic things. And the point is that you write a prompt. It's a text-to-image thing, as we all know, and in a space of 3 seconds you get an image, and much better resolution than the previous one. So this was really a big breakthrough. It wasn't it wasn't available to architects to begin with, but in May of 2022, I gave a lecture at the AA for the DRL, and I was talking about this, and I was going to say, well, when are architects eventually going to wake up to the potential of AI? When are they going to go through what I call the Sputnik moment? I won't go into that now, but when everyone wakes up about this possibility. And there was a voice in the audience that said, it's already happened, we've already recognized it. And I said, and it was Patrick Schumacher. And Patrick had been collaborating, maybe I should, before I talk about this, just briefly say, so it's based on a prompt, right? So this one was really quite startling because, people think AI copies. It does not copy. It really doesn't copy. It can't copy. Humans copy. We always got to copy trends and things. But this one's kind of interesting because it's saying an astronaut on a horse, and presumably there's never been a photograph of an astronaut on a horse, but it can interpolate. It can give you a sense of what it would be. So anyway, Patrick had been working with Refik Anadol, and because Refik had been given access to DALI 2 before it was made available to the public, and this is another order of quality better than the first image that he'd produced of Zaha's work. And this is the stuff that we have now. Of course, there have been many generations of this. Midjourney was available first and has been through a number of iterations, and we're now on version 6. This is something completely different. So this is the kind of the new world. Now, what is happening when we're using Midjourney? I want to just go back to this for a moment because I think this is kind of interesting. This is not what's happening with these diffusion models. It's not at all. But if you think about it, actually, it's the way that we operate. I personally think that human beings are very good discriminators. We sniff a perfume, we taste a cocktail, and instantaneously can tell if we like it or not. Same with architecture. You see an image, immediately. So we're very good discriminators. I don't think we're quite as creative as we like to think we are. I don't think we are. And what's happening is Midjourney is kind of giving us other options and kind of saying, what about this? What about this? What about this? And enhancing us. So I see it as a kind of prosthesis to the human imagination in some senses. So it's really helping the generator side of things. Anyway, and of course, what is going to happen is not going to be about this kind of stuff at all. It's going to be about, I think, process-based, often performance-based models. This is the work of Austrian Institute of Technology. In fact, Theodoros Kelanos, who was on the DDES program for a while, is based here in Melbourne. He's the kind of one of the geniuses who put together this particular software, looking at environmental control systems. This is what we call a surrogate model. It's not very accurate, but it gives you an impression about what it can do. And then, of course, also in Melbourne is Mike Shee, who's an engineer at RMIT, who has this generative structural program called Amoeba, which is kind of well known in certain circles. And I think this is where it's going to be about. It's going to be using AI to optimize things, to make performance, to enhance the performance of things, and so on. And it'll radically change the process, the design itself. So companies like this, I don't think SpaceMaker is so good. Actually, Foster and Partners don't even think they use AI. But I do think that this person, Manu Her, who I work with, is really talented. I'm supervising a PhD in Tongji and also a DDES at FIU with her. And she used to work for AMO. And she was working for OMA, sorry. And she was working first in Rotterdam, then in Hong Kong. And in Hong Kong, they were based in Lang Kwai Fong, which is like a nightclub area. And they were working till 2 in the morning, and everyone else was having fun downstairs and working over weekends. And she said, this is ridiculous. We've got to sort this out. So she's got a company called X-Cool, which means Ex-Koolhaas. But basically, it was the frustrations of working for Rem Koolhaas that led to what she's been doing. And then she's recently been launched a diffusion model, which has been based on architecture and architectural terminology, which is quite important because we have certain words like specification and things that no one else does. So, and she's got this thing called LookX, which I think is making a huge difference. Anyway, and we don't know, we can't find out exactly what they're doing. I know because she tells me, but it'll come on stream about 2 or 3 years' time, and we'll find that that's going to radically change everything. This was their fairly early work that was looking at this building does not exist, similar to what I was showing before. And it basically is going to be a single platform. Both Autodesk, which acquired a SpaceMaker, and X-Cool are integrating everything into a single platform. So you go from data to fabrication. Well, this is what LookX can do. You've probably seen the Simpsons thing on Frank Gehry, where Madge Simpson writes to him and he saying, "Can you build us an opera house?" And he said, "Humbug," and screws it up and then throws it onto the pavement and then looks at it and says, "Frank Gehry, you're a genius." And they build it. Well, that's what a bit of crumpled paper here. And actually, literally, if you put it through the neural network, it'll recognize it as a building either by Gehry or by Zaha. And I think this is also very significant. This is I don't want to say it's a great architecture, but it's not too bad. It's because Wendy was also an architect, and they entered this competition and won the prize for this particular project against 200 other architects in China. And what is interesting about it is that this was, I think, the first building that was really designed using generative AI. And what you can see here is this kind of rectilinear block being broken down through this kind of process until what we end up with is to do with wind comfort. What we end up with is something that is more kind of, let's say, Frank Gehry-like than rectilinear. And that's coming out of that sort of process. And one of the next things they did was then to look at the tiling of these forms. And they started off with 1,000 different tiles. They then asked a guy from Gehry Technologies who reduced it down to 100. And eventually they used AI to get it down to 10. But what's happened now is just this last week, and things change on a weekly or even daily basis in terms of AI, this building has just been opened. And I think it's historical because it's the first building constructed that was designed using generative AI. And so on. I won't go into this, but basically their theory of what they're going to do eventually is to go and base it on the idea of a smart Lego block. So you go from data to fabrication. Everything is tagged in its information-rich environment until you eventually get the product itself. Others, such as Foster and Partners, are not interested in using AI to generate images or anything like that, but they are interested in using AI to speed up the process and to make things much better. And this is maybe, I'm not talking today really much about this, but this is an important image for any educator here. This is a very crude diagram that came out, but based on some very important research that was done by MIT and Harvard sociologists looking at what happens when you use AI. And this is based on the question of quality, and there's a significant improvement, a 40% improvement in terms of the quality of the output when you use AI. I mean, we can expect to see a lot of different studies. This is not done for architecture. It was they were looking on ChatGPT, but they were using some design experiments as part of this, designing a shoe and so on. So anyway, this is hugely important. This is a kind of game changer. We can't survive without a calculator or spell check anymore, and we won't be able to survive without using AI for this. Now, the worrying thing is that, most people say, oh, architects, don't worry, we'll be fine, right? And they trot out this quote, AI won't replace humans, but humans with AI will replace those without AI. I get so annoyed when I see this because this is so dumb, because it assumes a one-for-one correlation. But the point is, when you actually look at it's not just the quality, there's also the quantity and the speed is hugely improved by AI. In other words, what's going to happen is going to be something more like this, that 3 people can do what 5 people can do. So it will have an impact on the office. It will make it difficult, or for some people, maybe it'll speed things up, but it'll bring certain challenges. And the other thing I'd say about AI is that we all thought it would be the blue-collar workers who would be out of a job first, right? Because we've seen these Tesla factories, there's not a single human being to be found there. But actually, that's a very controlled environment, and robots struggle to do much in an uncontrolled environment. If I put a bunch of Lego bricks on this desk here and asked the robotic arm to stack them up, it would struggle. It's got the motility of a six-month-old kid. It would really struggle. And meanwhile, AI has been racing ahead. And as I'll mention later, the point is it's learned how to code, and it's not going to be the blue-collar worker, it's going to be the white-collar workers who really are going to be struggling. In fact, at the moment in a Tesla, in an Amazon packing logistics factory, they have these kind of stacks that they bring on robotic, they're robotically brought along to the humans, and the humans do the stacking. Can you imagine that? That's all we can do, is stack these days, and soon that won't be the case either. So this is the thing I always say to the profession. I was talking to the Australian Institute of Architecture yesterday. What we need to design right now is not another building, but the very future of our profession. I think for education especially, because we're sending you guys out into a world of the singularity, whatever you're going to call it, and I think it's really important that education wakes up to this and absorbs all these things. I studied at Cambridge, where Dalibor Vasley would ban the computer from the studio. We all read Heidegger and we couldn't use the computer. And the smart students would all use the computer and can do fuzzy overlays, right? And the bad students just wouldn't use it. And they were totally unemployable. I think we've got to really get on terms with this. Anyway, I want to finish off now with talking about cities for Lyra and David. And I've got a section on what I call brain cities. So I'm going to break this down into 3 different sections. So first of all, the idea that AI, there is already a theory that AI, brains and cities are kind of connected, and I want to just delve into it. So my question would be is, what will the city of the future look like? And I've noticed that Melbourne's changed a lot in the last few years. But I mean, a lot of cities, will they look something out of the Jetsons and be totally science fiction, or will they look much like the cities of today? This is LA, but with the buildings kind of retrofitted and updated with the latest technology. Anyway, in 2009, I published this AD on digital cities, and the architects contributing to it took it upon themselves to kind of predict what the city of the future would look like. And this is Patrick Schumacher, who is imagining the parametric city. This was the first ever article that he wrote on parametricism. Wolf Pricks calls him parapatrics. Anyway, and he imagined this city, but we've seen all these proposals. This is one's for Istanbul, and this one's for Singapore. Have they been materialized? No, not really. And all the other architects were all also giving their vision of what the future of the city would look like. Meanwhile, there's this guy, Ben Bratton, who wrote this essay. I mean, Ben is very smart, called iPhone City. And what he pointed out, which I think is really important, was that the simple device, the iPhone, has changed the way in which we navigate and enjoy our cities more than any architect could possibly do. Anyway, so I mean, I guess the point is this: is that to my mind, the future of our cities is going to be based probably on most of our buildings being retrofitted with these new technologies. They won't look different. I'm not sure I've got an image in this presentation, but Ali, I forget his name, Harvard GSD, who runs the environmental thing. He's got a building. He's literally Ali Markawi, and he's just put all these sensors on it, and it's got a digital brain inside it. That's really what's going to happen. It's not so different, but the technology is going to be used in a very sophisticated way. So my point would be this: I mean, Mario Carpo keeps talking about what will the new architecture look like. It won't look so different. It's wrong to think about form. If you want to understand what it's going to look like, I mean, think about an Uber car. Does an Uber car look different to an ordinary car? No, because it is an ordinary car. It's just the way that it operates. It's the informational systems that are going to be changing. And to my mind, this is the way that the future will be. And I think the architect will become increasingly the informational architect. This is actually an architect from China who went to work for Uber as a visualizer of the Uber. And I guess this is kind of obvious in some sense, and we're using satellite information and so on. But there's one particular company in China that I would point out called City Brain, which literally makes that connection between the brain and the city, and is using a digital twin. What do I mean by digital twin? Well, there are many different meanings of a digital twin, but the one I use is a kind of real-time feedback from the actual world, as it were, that then is fed into AI to use the intelligence of AI to improve the performance, so environmental performance, or in case of a city, the way that traffic flows through it. And they claim, City Brain, that they solve all the traffic problems and you can locate an accident before anyone reports it and so on. And I won't go into this, but there's a whole discourse about how the city and the brain are kind of similar for different sort of reasons. And they come to the conclusion that cities can think. We certainly didn't think that AI could think, but maybe it can, as I'll mention later on. So the second thing I'd say is that there has already been a whole discourse that's connecting computers and cities and brains, and that's the kind of theory of emergence that started off with John Holland, whom we interviewed for our book on swarm intelligence on the far right there. And then Stephen Johnson put together a book that came out on the day of 9/11, where he makes this connection, emergence, the connected lives of ants, brains, cities, and softwares. And the theory of emergence was certainly very popular when I first started teaching at the AA when Lara was a student there, and it was the hot thing. We were all talking about emergence and emergent capabilities. And the principle was this: emergence is how you get complexity arising from simple rules. A flock of birds, the birds are kind of like going in a certain direction, keeping a certain distance from the birds on either side and the bird in front, and are going at roughly the same speed. But out of that, in a bottom-up way, something emerges, a kind of behavior, a kind of a choreography, a murmuration of starlings and things that begins to appear. That's not programmed, but then just simply emerges. And that term emergence, which is kind of mysterious in some way because we can't actually, we see evidence of it all over nature, but we can't really explain it, as Stephen Johnson, as John Holland points out. And we can also see it in the kind of the schools of fish, flocks of birds, and so on. And to some extent, architecturally, this is a kind of a hillside town in Greece where they're kind of abutting one another in a kind of similar kind of logic, or indeed in Marrakesh, you can see this kind of logic. All the favelas in South America, there is a kind of, you can see this application. There's also the notion of how we can have pheromone trails being used to make things happen. Slime mold is actually based on these millions or thousands of little agents that come together into a single entity to go foraging for food, and they've looked at how you can use a slime mold to, in this case, to model the subway system in Tokyo. You put little pellets of food, and then the slime mold begins to sort of form certain pathways. It withers off when it's not getting any feedback, but then consolidates itself when it is. So the theory of emergence has been around for some time, and in ways humans do this. This is a photograph I took from the plane coming out of Beijing, and you can see how humans lay their own trails. There's a road at the top, the engineering road, but humans kind of form their own trails. There was a case once of a professor of biology once who had a building built, and he said, don't put the landscaping out, let's just wait and see what people do when there's been a frost or some snow, and they found those routes. So this kind of logic appears all over the place. Roland Snooks has been doing this. This is actually in Melbourne, where he's been doing these sort of trails to go and find pathways. This logic of swarm intelligence was really a central part of architecture in the first 1.5 decades, I guess, of this century, and became quite important, and fed into architectural design. This is a project for a museum in Korea that he collaborated with a Chinese architect, and so on. Let me just briefly touch on another aspect of where it's connecting brains with cities. John Holland makes this comment about how cities have this strange capacity to kind of maintain their equilibrium without, somehow, despite everything, cities can be able to do that. And the neuroscientist Antonio Damasio has a very similar concept about how the brain works. It's governed by what he calls a form of homeostasis. It's kind of stabilizing itself. The brain is less a command control center than something that is trying to, calm you down when you get agitated and stimulate you when you get lethargic and so on. And there was this other guy called William Ashby who made a homeostat, a kind of based on negative feedback, to try and model how the brain works. Just as an aside, Alan Turing saw this and wrote to him and saying, why don't you use my early computer? And he makes this comment, I'm more interested in the possibility of producing models of the action of the brain than the practical applications of computing. The interface between neuroscience and AI is fascinating. Anyway, let me move on to what I think is the most terrifying part of today, right? These are things called large language models. Most people don't use this term. It sounds very unsexy. But this is what is going on. This is what GPT and these other things are. They're large language models. It's a complete understatement. They're not large. They're absolutely massive. They're trained on trillions of bits of information and billions of parameters. And what is disturbing about these things is they have these things called emergent capabilities or emergent abilities. Nobody trained them how to write. Nobody trained them how to translate languages. And nobody trained them how to write code, and yet they can. This is the disturbing thing. And what makes it very interesting in the context of emergence itself is it's not because of the computational sophistication. Apparently only 200 lines of code in one of these large language models. But the bigger the data set, and they're getting bigger every time, every year they're going up 10 times, the more data on which they're trained, so they go up 10 times every year, that's 100 times every 2 years. The more data on which they're trained, the more they begin to exhibit these emerging capabilities. And this is what's terrifying people in this world, right? So you have, on the one hand, on the left-hand side, the letter that was issued by the Future of Life Institute saying, listen, hold on a second, there's something disturbing here. Let's stop us, let's slow down a second and until we figured out what's going on. But it's something pretty scary. Geoffrey Hinton himself quits Google so he can talk about these things. And Yoshua Bengio, one of his PhD students, has got it. Everyone's worried about this because all of a sudden it's working, but it's working too well, and we don't know quite why, and we're just blown away by what's happening. So the Future of Life Institute actually issued this letter, which Elon Musk and a few others signed, And they mention here this thing. It doesn't mean a pause on AI development in general, merely a stepping back from the dangerous race to ever greater, unpredictable black box models with emergent capabilities. Now, this letter was doomed to failure. I mean, it's a bit like asking the leaders in the Olympic marathon to slow down. You're not going to slow down, your competitors are going to catch up. And certainly when Google and Microsoft are racing against each other, they're not going to slow down. It's ridiculous. So it was a complete failure. But the question is whether we're seeing this concept of emergence. Can we see this as being part of this? And now this is not so clear because emergence is based on complexity coming out of simple rules. At the same time, swarm intelligence, this kind of flocking behavior, is a manifestation of it. And the fact that it's a multi-agent system and the fact that these large language models are based on such massive amounts of data kind of suggests that maybe we should pursuing that to try and understand what is going on. But we're left with black boxes. The brain's a black box. The neural network's a black box. And emergence itself seems to be a kind of black box. Anyway, there are various people who are a bit alarmed by this, including Yuval Harari, who basically says that now it's learned how to write, AI has hacked the operating system of human beings. Once you can write, you can persuade people, and you have an amazing capacity. I actually think that it's not only learned to write, it's also learned how to design. I mean, this is just one of the many. I'm sure you've all been doing this, but this is actually not the latest version of Midjourney. It's like Midjourney 5.3 or something. But anyway, what I did with this, my prompts are not. Talk about prompt engineering. They're not precise at all. You know, it's like alchemy. Anyway, I developed my prompts, and they were about 70 words long, and they referred to the lighting conditions, the rendering, the hyper-realistic detailing and things. But actually, the only words I used for architecture in this particular one was ultra-contemporary modernist villa in the Austrian Alps. I didn't tell it how to design the valley in the background or the mountains on the background or the boulder in the foreground. I didn't say anything about the materials being used at all. Midjourney did that. It just did it. Or this one. I asked for an ultra-contemporary stainless steel kitchen. I didn't refer to the painting in the background or the bush outside or the coffee maker or the tap or anything. It just put these together. It designed it. It put it together. And of course, Midjourney often doesn't come up with very good things, but occasionally it does come up with other good things. Or this thing, I mean, I don't know how long it would take an architect to render this, but this was done in 3 seconds. So don't go into rendering, because that's an obsolete profession. That is one of those places where give up. You know, anyway, that itself was kind of a little bit terrifying, right? It's kind of learned how to design. But this is even more terrifying. This is Sora. Sora has not been released yet. We've seen some examples of this. And Sora is a text-to-video AI-based software, which, and we've had that around since the end of 2022. But this is a completely different. This is stunningly good in terms of resolution and things. It can go on for up to 60 seconds, and as we'll see in a second, it can go close in and get detail that is pretty astonishing. So this is kind of people are raising their eyebrows and saying, what the hell is happening here? How do they manage to do it? It works in a very similar way to actually how a large language model uses. But instead of using tokens for words, it uses patches for images, but it's based on that. Massive amounts of data, and they're managing to do this kind of thing. What's more, it's beginning to do it's beginning to exhibit certain forms of emergent capabilities. One of them is this notion of occlusion, when something comes out of the frame and comes back into again. So we see that house in the background, and all of a sudden they don't disappear behind, then they reappear. It was not trained to do that, and it's very good at occlusion. But I think the more disturbing one in some senses is the way, and I don't know how to put this exactly, but the way it seems to have a grasp of, let's say, 3D rigging in some senses. This is I think Moorhen or something, I'm not quite sure. Someone put their phone up and recognized it on Google the other day. And what happens, watch it turn around. Look at that. I mean, the sense of 3D modeling is pretty astonishing. And I think we're getting pretty close to the point where we'll be able to really sort of model these things in architecture. And of course, architects say, well, they won't happen to us, we're fine, right? But this is what it can do, right? Text to video, Sora, I don't know how long an architect would take to do this, but this was done in 3 seconds on Sora. Sora has not been released now. Maybe they're cherry-picking all the very best, and maybe they're doing some post-production, but there's enough here to make you pretty damn worried. There's something here that is pretty astonishing, that is going to change the nature, and certainly the metaverse. I mean, forget that. This is going to be in charge of things now. So I want to go back to Geoffrey Hinton in the last few minutes I've got, just to mention him, because I think in a way, the problem has been, in terms of comparing AI to the brain, has been that there have been simplistic comparisons. Ray Kurzweil talks about AI comparing to human intelligence, and talks about the singularity and God knows what else. But I think you need to break it down into particular cognitive skills, into knowledge, into understanding, into thinking, and so on. And Geoffrey Hinton, because he has a background in neuroscience, is able to do that. Anyway, he's come out of Google and terrified. And this is maybe what he has to... Let me just kind of play what he has to say. I think it's very interesting.
It made me realize that these digital intelligences have something we don't have that makes them much better. When one of them knows something, it can tell all the others. That's what we don't have with people. So imagine you had 10,000 people, and imagine if when one person learned something, everybody knew it. You could learn a lot more stuff, right?
Right.
And that's why things like ChatGPT knows like 10,000 times as much as any one person. It's because when you train it, there's lots of different copies looking at different bits of the data and learning stuff, and they can all combine what they learn instantly with a bandwidth of like trillions of bits.
So can they think?
Yes. So imagine the following scenario. I'm talking to chatbot, and we talk for a bit, and the answers it's given me seem a bit strange to me, and I suddenly realize that it thinks I'm a teenage girl. And I say, what demographic do you think I am? And it says it thinks I'm a teenage girl. So the question is, when I said I suddenly realized it thinks I'm a teenage girl, was that a metaphorical use of the word think, or was that just the same way as we use think? And I strongly believe that use of the word think, when I said it thinks I'm a teenage girl, was exactly the same way of using think as we do with people.
And so that was enough to make you say, what, this has accelerated beyond my comfort level?
I suddenly realized maybe they already are better, and making them more like real neural nets isn't the point. They're already better than us. They're a better way of doing learning. And if we make them bigger, they'll get much smarter than us. They already know more than any one person.
I understand that things could go awry, but I still think that people hear the notion of danger and they dismiss it as hyperbole.
I thought it was hyperbole for a long time because I thought these things were a long way off. I thought there will eventually be danger, but I thought focusing on it now is unnecessary because it'll be 30 to 50 years before these things get more intelligent than us. But this combination of realizing that they might have a much better way of learning than we have, because they can share knowledge instantly, and seeing things like ChatGPT or Palm at Google that can explain why a joke is funny, made me realize these things are already pretty intelligent, and if they've got a better form of intelligence than ours, then it gets to be much more urgent.
So, I mean, briefly, I won't come much time here, but he thinks that AI has got a form of intelligence that is very, very different to human intelligence. It's a mechanical form of intelligence, but it nonetheless is vastly superior. It knows, ChatGPT knows 10,000 times more. It can begin to understand. He figured out, if you can explain a joke to him, it can understand that joke. It figured out that ChatGPT doesn't just predict a word, it understands a sentence, and so on, and so on, and so on. I think I would be careful about the word think. I would put think in inverted commas. I certainly think we'd put intelligence in inverted commas. But nonetheless, you can see what he's basically pointing towards. Let me give you Yuval Harari just to go back there.
This is the end of human history. The end of human-dominated history. History will continue with somebody else in control. In 5 years, there'll be a technology that can make decisions independently and that can create new ideas independently. Maybe they'll be nice. Maybe they'll solve cancer and climate change, but we are not sure. I'm tending to think of it more in terms of really an alien invasion, an alien fleet of spaceships coming from planet Zircon or whatever, with highly intelligent beings. This is what we are facing, except that the aliens are not coming in spaceships from planet Zircon, they're coming from the laboratory. If the humans are divided among themselves and are in an arms race, then it becomes almost impossible to contain this alien intelligence.
Alien intelligence. So Nicholas Copernicus was responsible for pronouncing on the first Copernican revolution. The universe didn't revolve around the Earth, but the Earth revolved around the sun. I think there should be a second Copernican revolution where we understand that we are not the center of intelligent entities in the universe. And our real problem is looking down on AI and saying, oh, it's not sentient, it's not conscious, it's not, whatever. What if AI were to think about us? He'd probably think we're completely stupid and unbelievably slow. The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy said this was something that influenced me when I was younger. There's Deep Thought, which you probably know, is this massive computer that works out the meaning of life, the universe, and everything. It takes 7.5 thousand years. I think ChatGPT's learned how to code, how to translate. It's probably worked out what the human cultural genome is. The only difference is it's not going to take 7.95 million years. It's going to take 3 seconds. But don't panic. We shouldn't worry too much. And let me finish with this guy, Arthur C. Clarke, just to reassure us that we'll be quite all right. This is amazing.
However, the most intelligent inhabitants of that future world won't be men or monkeys. They'll be machines, the remote descendants of today's computers. Now, the present-day electronic brains are complete morons, but this will not be true in another generation. They will start to think, and eventually they will completely outthink their makers. Is this depressing? I don't see why it should be. We superseded the Cro-Magnon and Neanderthal men, and we presume we're an improvement. I think we should regard it as a privilege to be stepping stones to higher things. I suspect that organic or biological evolution has about come to its end, and we are now at the beginning of inorganic or mechanical evolution, which will be thousands of times swifter.
So, what he's saying is we shouldn't panic. And I think the point here is, as I was talking about the brain homeostasis, we are a very adaptive people. We sort things out, we get used to things, and we'll get used to a world where there's less work and so on. That's, I think, why humans are so good. Neuroscientists say we've got plastic brains, we adapt. Now, if 50 years ago, someone had told me in 50 years' time, most marriages would end in divorce, I think, oh my God, the world's falling apart, it's the end of civilization. Well, it's happened. We've got used to it. Most marriages do end in divorce. And in the future, we will not have so much work as architects, but we'll get used to it, we'll adapt. So I'm going to finish off with a very British comment. Keep calm and carry on. We don't have any time for questions, but if you want to send me a question on Instagram, you're most welcome to. And don't forget, Digital Futures International's got a bunch of really useful tutorials, especially on neuroscience and AI copyright and a few other issues, and they're all for free. So take a look at that. And I've done it in 1 hour. Okay.